I found my 8-year-old son selling hot dogs at the zoo. He said, "Dad makes me work while he takes his son to see the animals." "What do you mean he makes you work?" I stood there at the zoo concession stand staring at my son Leo wearing an apron that was way too big for him while holding a pair of tongs and serving hot dogs to confused customers. I'd come to surprise them since my husband Craig said he was taking both boys for a special zoo day, but instead, I found Leo behind the counter, while Craig and his son from his first marriage, Jamie, were nowhere to be seen. Dad said I need to earn my keep. Leo handed a hot dog to a woman who looked uncomfortable buying food from a child. He said Jamie's ticket costs money, so I have to help pay for it. The woman looked at me shocked. "Is this your son?" "He's been here for 2 hours selling food." 2 hours. My 8-year-old had been working at a concession stand for 2 hours. "Where's your father?" Leo pointed toward the lion exhibit. "He and Jamie are doing the VIP safari tour. They'll be back in an hour." The VIP tour that costs $200 per person. "He left you here alone?" Leo shook his head. "Mr. Frank is watching me." He pointed to a teenage employee who was sitting on his phone. "Dad pays him $20 to make sure I don't leave the stand." I walked over to Frank, who didn't even look up. "You're letting an 8-year-old work?" Frank shrugged. His dad said it was fine. Said the kid needs to learn responsibility. He finally looked at me. "You the mom? Your husband said you were cool with it." I was definitely not cool with it. "How many times has this happened?" Frank laughed. "Every Saturday for the past 2 months. Kid's actually pretty good at it." He showed me his phone. "Your husband even made him a little schedule." The schedule showed Leo working 4-hour shifts every Saturday while Craig and Jamie enjoyed the zoo. "He's 8 years old. This is child labor." Frank shrugged again. "Not my problem. I just make sure he doesn't burn himself on the hot dog roller." That's when Leo called out. "Mom, I can't leave." Dad said if I don't finish my shift, he won't bring me next time. He thought this was normal. He thought working at a concession stand was part of going to the zoo. "Honey, you don't have to work. You're supposed to be seeing the animals." Leo's face fell. "But Dad said Jamie's special and deserves to see everything. I'm just regular, so I have to contribute. Just regular." My husband was calling my son regular while treating his other son like royalty. A zoo employee in a manager shirt walked over. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" I pointed at Leo. "My son is working at your concession stand." The manager looked confused. "That's not possible. We don't employ children." Frank suddenly got nervous. His dad said it was volunteer work, like teaching him about business. The manager's face changed. "Sir, we need to see your supervisor immediately." While Frank scrambled to explain, I helped Leo take off the apron. "But Dad will be mad," Leo said, worried. He said if I'm good at this job, he'll let me work at his office too. Craig was planning to make our son work at his real estate office. "Jamie never has to work. Dad says he's going to be a thinker, not a worker." The manager returned with security. "We're reviewing footage now. This is completely against policy." That's when Craig appeared with Jamie, who was wearing a new zoo t-shirt and carrying 3 stuffed animals. "What's going on?" "Leo, why aren't you at your station?" He said station like Leo was an employee. "His station?" "He's 8 years old, Craig." Craig rolled his eyes. "Don't be dramatic. He's learning valuable skills." He put his hand on Jamie's shoulder. "Some kids are meant for education, and some are meant for labor." The security guard stepped forward. "Sir, we need to talk to you about illegally using our facilities." Craig laughed. "Illegally? My son was just helping out." The manager pulled out a tablet showing security footage. "Your son has been serving food to customers. That's a health code violation and child labor." Craig tried to grab Leo. "We're leaving. This place is run by idiots anyway." But the security guard blocked him. "Sir, we've called the police. You need to wait here." Jamie finally spoke up, and he was smirking. "Dad's in trouble." He seemed happy about it. "Told you Leo would rat us out. He's too weak to handle real work. My 11-year-old stepson was calling my 8-year-old weak. That's why Dad says I'm going to inherit the business and Leo's going to work for me." Craig had been telling his sons that one would own and one would work. "Craig, what have you been telling them?" He looked annoyed that I was asking. "The truth. Jamie has potential. Leo is better suited for simple tasks." He said this in front of both children. "It's not mean, it's realistic." The zoo manager was furious. "You've been using your son as unpaid labor and pocketing the tips." "Tips? What tips?" The manager showed the tablet again. "Customers have been tipping him. About $60 each Saturday." Craig's face went red. I watched the color drain from his face and then flood back even darker. The manager tapped the screen again, showing another date, then another. 8 weeks of deposits. 8 weeks of my son working while Craig pocketed money that strangers gave to a child. The police arrived faster than I expected. 2 officers walking through the crowd that had started gathering around the concession stand. The zoo manager met them first, tablet still in hand, already explaining the situation before they even reached us. One officer, a woman with her hair pulled back tight, looked at Leo and then at Craig, her expression hardening. The other officer, older with gray at his temples, asked Craig to step aside while his partner approached me and Leo. She knelt down so she was at Leo's eye level and asked him his name, how old he was, how long he'd been working here. Leo answered each question carefully, like he was worried about getting the answers wrong. He kept glancing at Craig, who was now several feet away talking to the other officer, his voice getting louder. The female officer stood up and told me they needed to separate the children from Craig while they reviewed the footage and got statements. I pulled Leo close to me, feeling him lean into my side. Jamie stood off to the side, still holding his stuffed animals, watching everything with that same smirk. The zoo manager led us to a back office while the officers stayed with Craig. Through the window, I could see him gesturing, pointing, his face red and angry. Leo tugged on my sleeve and whispered that he was sorry, that he didn't mean to get Dad in trouble, that he should have just finished his shift like he was supposed to. My heart broke listening to him apologize for being rescued from child labor. I told him he didn't do anything wrong, that none of this was his fault, but he just looked down at his shoes. The manager brought us water and crackers, though neither boy touched them. Jamie finally spoke up, asking when they could leave because he was bored. Not worried, not concerned, just bored. The female officer came in about 20 minutes later and explained that this was a clear violation of child labor laws. She said they needed to file a report with Child Protective Services for a welfare check, because making an 8-year-old work at a concession stand showed possible exploitation. She asked me questions about Leo's home life, his school, whether Craig had made him work other places. I told her about the comments, about Jamie getting the VIP tour while Leo worked, about Craig's plan to have Leo work at his real estate office. She wrote everything down. Through the window, I could hear Craig's voice getting louder, yelling that I was overreacting and trying to turn everyone against him. The security guard appeared at the office door and asked the officer if she needed backup. She shook her head but told him to stay close. Craig's voice carried through the walls, saying this was ridiculous, that he was teaching his son responsibility, that everyone was making a huge deal out of nothing. The officer told me I could take both boys home while Craig stayed to give his statement. She said someone from CPS would contact me within 24 hours for the welfare check. I gathered both boys, Leo still wearing his too big apron until I realized and helped him take it off. We walked past Craig, who tried to grab my arm, but the officer stepped between us. He shouted after us that this was all my fault, that I was poisoning Leo against him, that I was going to regret making a scene. The parking lot felt too bright after the dim office. I buckled both boys into the back seat, Leo on one side and Jamie on the other. Jamie stared out the window, arms crossed, bottom lip pushed out. Leo kept asking if he was going to get in trouble for leaving his shift early, if the zoo would be mad at him, if Dad would be okay. I tried to reassure him while navigating out of the parking lot, but every word I said seemed to bounce off him. He'd been so thoroughly convinced that working was his job, that earning his keep was his responsibility, that he couldn't hear anything else. The drive home took 30 minutes and Jamie didn't say a single word the entire time. Leo asked the same questions over and over in slightly different ways, each one revealing how deeply Craig had damaged his understanding of what 8-year-olds are supposed to do. When we got home, I sent both boys to wash up and change clothes. I stood in the kitchen gripping the counter, trying to process what had just happened. My husband had been exploiting our son for months, not just asking him to do chores or help out, but actually making him work a job while stealing his tips. I needed to see proof, needed to confirm what I already knew. After I got both boys settled with snacks in front of the TV, I went to our home office and pulled up our bank statements. I started with the most recent month and worked backward. There it was. Every Saturday for the past 8 weeks, a cash deposit of $50 to $70. The amounts varied, but the pattern was clear. I went back further. 3 months, 4 months. The deposits went back 6 months. Different amounts, but always on Saturdays. Craig had been doing this even longer than the zoo manager knew about. I printed everything, highlighting each deposit with a yellow marker. The evidence sat in my hands. Dozens of pages showing systematic theft from a child. Our child. I heard the boys laughing at something on TV and felt sick. Leo thought this was normal. He thought he deserved this. That night I made dinner and tried to act like everything was fine. But Jamie kept asking when Dad was coming home and Leo kept apologizing for things that weren't his fault. I put them both to bed early, reading Leo an extra story because he seemed anxious. He asked me again if Dad was mad at him. I told him Dad made bad choices and that's not Leo's problem to fix. He didn't look convinced. The next morning, a woman knocked on our door at 9. She introduced herself as a social worker there for the welfare check. I let her in and called both boys downstairs. She asked to speak with each of them separately, starting with Leo. I waited in the kitchen, hearing the murmur of voices from the living room but not the actual words. Leo was in there for almost 30 minutes. When the door opened, I heard him explaining his work schedule like he was describing his chores, his voice matter-of-fact and slightly proud. The social worker's face when she came into the kitchen told me everything. She looked tired and sad and angry all at once. She asked to speak with Jamie next. He was only in there 15 minutes and came out looking annoyed. The social worker asked me for permission to look at Leo's room, to see where he sleeps and does homework. I showed her upstairs, pointing out that both boys have their own rooms with desks and bookshelves and toys. She thanked me and said someone would be in touch soon. After she left, I called the number she'd given me for a family law attorney named Caitlin Hudson. The receptionist said she had an opening that same afternoon at 3. I arranged for a neighbor to watch the boys and drove downtown to her office. The building was older but well-maintained, with a small waiting room that smelled like coffee. Caitlin came out exactly at 3, a woman in her 40s with short dark hair and a firm handshake. She led me back to her office and listened while I explained everything. She didn't interrupt, just nodded and took notes. When I finished, she asked to see the bank statements. I handed her the stack of highlighted pages and watched her review them, her expression getting harder with each page. She looked up and told me bluntly that Craig's behavior showed a pattern of exploitation and psychological abuse that went way beyond one incident at the zoo. She said the bank statements proved financial exploitation, the security footage proved child labor violations, and Leo's own words to the social worker proved emotional abuse. She explained that I needed to document everything, starting immediately. She wanted a detailed account of Leo's daily routine, any instances where Craig treated the boys differently, any comments Craig made about their futures or their worth. She said to write down everything I could remember, no matter how small it seemed. I spent the rest of that day filling pages with memories I wished I'd paid more attention to at the time. Craig telling Leo he needed to help more around the house while Jamie got to play video games. Craig saying Leo should focus on practical skills instead of advanced math classes. Craig explaining that some people were naturally gifted, and others had to work harder to find their place. I wrote it all down with my hand cramping and my stomach twisting because seeing it laid out like this made it impossible to pretend these were isolated incidents. This was a pattern. This was intentional. The next morning, I drove to Craig's office without calling first. The receptionist looked surprised when I walked past her desk toward the back offices. I found Craig's business partner sitting at his desk reviewing contracts. He looked up and stood quickly when he saw my face. I asked if we could talk privately about Craig and Leo. He closed his office door and gestured to a chair. I explained what had happened at the zoo and what I'd discovered about the tip money and the work shifts. His expression shifted from confused to uncomfortable to genuinely concerned as I talked. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. He told me he'd been worried about some of Craig's recent decisions. He said Craig had been talking a lot about legacy planning and business succession, and every conversation seemed to favor Jamie exclusively. He mentioned Craig had brought up the idea of Jamie joining the firm after college, while Leo could handle administrative work or property maintenance. I felt my chest tighten hearing this confirmation that Craig's plans went far beyond the zoo. He said he'd been uncomfortable with the way Craig talked about the boys like they were already sorted into categories, but he hadn't realized it had gone this far. He agreed to document any conversations about the boys and provide a statement if I needed one. He said he couldn't support a partner who exploited his own child, and he meant it. I thanked him, and left feeling like I had one more piece of evidence that this wasn't just me being dramatic or overprotective. Caitlin had given me the name of a child psychologist who specialized in family dynamics. I called from the parking lot and got an appointment for the next afternoon. I picked Leo up from the school early and told him we were going to talk to someone who helped kids figure out their feelings. He asked if he was in trouble. I said no. We just wanted to make sure he was doing okay after everything that happened. The office was in a medical building with cheerful paintings on the walls and a waiting room full of toys. A man came out and introduced himself and shook Leo's hand like he was meeting another adult. He asked Leo to come back to his office and told me I could wait in the reception area. I sat there for 40 minutes watching the clock and trying not to imagine what Leo was saying. When the door opened, Leo came out looking relaxed and told me the doctor was nice and had a really cool fish tank. The psychologist asked if I could stay for a few minutes to talk. I followed him back to his office and sat in the same chair Leo had used. He asked Leo to wait outside with the receptionist. Then he turned to me with a serious expression and explained that during their conversation, Leo had casually mentioned several things that concerned him. Leo said he knew he wasn't as smart as Jamie because his dad had explained that some people were meant to think, and some were meant to work. Leo said he was okay being a worker because everyone had to have a job, and his job was to help out. The psychologist said this, so matter-of-factly, that it took me a second to process how awful it was hearing my 8-year-old's internalized beliefs spoken out loud. He told me Leo showed signs of internalized inferiority, and had been conditioned to accept differential treatment as normal and deserved. He said Leo genuinely believed his father's assessment of his worth and capabilities. He recommended therapy sessions twice a week, and warned me that undoing this kind of psychological damage would take time. He said it would be especially difficult while Leo was still living with Craig, and being exposed to the same messages that created the problem. I asked what I should do, and he said I needed to consider whether Leo's current living situation was healthy for his development. He couldn't tell me what to do legally, but he could tell me that continued exposure to someone who viewed Leo as inherently less valuable would make recovery nearly impossible. I scheduled the twice-weekly appointments and took Leo home feeling like I was watching my son slip further away from me, even though he was sitting right there in the passenger seat. That Saturday morning, Craig announced he was taking the boys to the Science Museum. I told him Leo wasn't going anywhere with him unsupervised. Craig's face went red and he asked what I meant by that. I said exactly what I said. He wasn't taking Leo anywhere alone. Craig started yelling that I was poisoning Leo against him and destroying their father-son relationship. I pointed out that he was the one who turned their relationship into an employer-employee situation. He said I was being dramatic and unreasonable and I was going to ruin everything over one misunderstanding. I told him there was no misunderstanding. He'd been exploiting our son for months, and I had the bank statements and witness statements to prove it. He grabbed his keys and said he was taking Jamie then, and I could explain to Leo why he had to stay home. I said that was fine and watched him storm out with Jamie following behind looking confused. Leo asked why he couldn't go, and I explained that Dad needed to understand some important things before they could spend time together like they used to. Leo nodded, but I could see he thought he'd done something wrong. Monday morning, Caitlin called and said she was filing for emergency custody modification and a protective order requiring supervised visitation. She explained the paperwork cited the child labor violations, financial exploitation, and psychological harm documented by the therapist. Craig would be served with papers at his office that afternoon. I asked what would happen next, and she said we'd have a hearing within a few weeks where a judge would decide on temporary custody arrangements. She warned me Craig would probably react badly to being served. I thanked her and tried to prepare myself for whatever was coming. At 4:30, my phone rang. Craig was screaming so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. He said I was destroying our family over one misunderstanding. He said I was turning his own son against him. He said he'd fight this and I'd regret trying to take Leo away. I hung up and blocked his number and sat there shaking while Leo asked from the doorway if everything was okay. 2 days later, Caitlin called with news from the forensic accountant she'd hired to review our finances. The accountant had found that Craig had been depositing Leo's tip money for 8 weeks, totaling $480. But there were also suspicious cash deposits going back 6 months before the zoo shifts started that might indicate this had been happening longer than we knew. The pattern suggested Craig had been exploiting Leo in various ways for at least half a year. The accountant was preparing a detailed report with highlighted deposits and corresponding dates. Caitlin said this evidence was even more damaging than she'd expected, because it showed premeditation and a sustained pattern of financial exploitation. I asked what Craig could possibly have had Leo doing 6 months ago, and she said we might never know everything, but the financial records didn't lie. Thursday afternoon, Caitlin called again. Craig's attorney had contacted her trying to negotiate. They were offering to return the tip money and promising Leo wouldn't work anymore. Caitlin asked if I wanted to consider their offer. I said no. She sounded pleased and told them we weren't interested in deals because the issue was Craig's fundamental belief system about the boy's worth. The tip money was just evidence of a much bigger problem. She said Craig's lawyer had sounded worried, which meant they knew the evidence was damaging, and they were scrambling to limit the damage before it got to court. The custody evaluation happened the following week. A court-appointed evaluator interviewed both boys separately, along with me and Craig. I didn't get to hear what either boy said during their sessions. But Caitlin called me that evening and said the evaluator had shared some concerning information from Jamie's interview. Jamie told the evaluator that his dad always said he was special because he was smart like Craig's side of the family. He said Leo took after my side and needed more structure and work to succeed. The evaluator noted in her report that Jamie had been taught to view his stepbrother as inherently inferior, and this was affecting both boys' development. She recommended family therapy for Jamie to address the harmful beliefs he'd internalized, and continued individual therapy for Leo. I spent that evening thinking about Craig's ex-wife. I'd met her a few times at Jamie's school events, but we'd never really talked beyond pleasantries. I found her number in my phone and called before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the third ring, sounding cautious. I explained what had been happening with Leo and Craig, and how Craig's beliefs were affecting both boys. There was a long silence. Then she said she wasn't surprised. She told me Craig had tried similar things during their marriage, constantly ranking people as winners or workers. She said that attitude was part of why she left him. She'd seen him start to view Jamie through that lens, and she couldn't let her son grow up thinking people had predetermined worth based on arbitrary categories. She said she'd been worried about what Craig was teaching Jamie during his custody time, but she hadn't known how bad it had gotten. I asked if she would be willing to provide a statement about Craig's pattern of thinking. She said yes immediately. Then she offered to talk to Jamie about his father's flawed beliefs. She said she was worried about what Craig had been teaching him, and she wanted to be more involved in countering those messages. She said Jamie was a good kid underneath the stuff Craig had filled his head with, and she wasn't going to let Craig turn her son into someone who looked down on others. We talked for another 20 minutes, and I felt relief knowing Jamie had at least one parent trying to protect him from Craig's toxic worldview. The custody hearing happened 4 weeks after I filed the paperwork. Craig's lawyer stood up first and tried to make the zoo incident sound like a simple mistake in judgment. He talked about how Craig was teaching Leo responsibility and work ethic. He said modern parents coddle their children too much, and Craig was preparing Leo for the real world. The lawyer made it sound like I was overreacting to a father spending quality time with his sons. Then Caitlin stood up and laid out everything we had collected. She showed the judge the bank statements with Craig's cash deposits that matched Leo's work schedule perfectly. She presented Arthur's written statement about Craig planning to have Leo work at the real estate office doing filing and basic tasks. She brought up Christian's evaluation showing Leo believed he was inferior to Jamie and needed to earn his place in the family. Then Melanie took the stand and explained how Craig had always divided people into winners and workers during their marriage. She described how he started viewing Jamie through that same lens before she left him. The judge's expression changed as each piece of evidence came out. His face got more serious with every document Caitlin presented. Craig kept whispering to his lawyer and shaking his head like none of this was true. The judge called Leo into his chambers to talk privately. I waited outside with my hands shaking and my stomach tight. Leo was in there for 15 minutes. When he came out, his eyes were red, but he wasn't crying anymore. He walked straight to me and grabbed my hand. The first thing he said was asking if he gave the right answers. I knelt down next to him and told him that telling the truth was perfect, and he wasn't in any kind of trouble. He nodded, but kept holding my hand really tight. Craig tried to come over to us, but the bailiff stepped between us and told him to stay on his side of the hallway. We went back into the courtroom, and the judge started reading his decision. He gave me primary custody of Leo, with Craig only getting supervised visits every other weekend. He ordered Craig to take parenting classes about child development and what expectations were appropriate for different ages. The judge said Craig had to pay back the $480 in tips directly into Leo's savings account within 30 days. Then the judge looked right at Craig and said any future exploitation would result in complete termination of his parental rights. Craig's face went pale. His lawyer tried to object, but the judge said the decision was final. 3 months passed and everything changed. Leo started going to therapy twice a week, and Christian said he was making real progress. Leo joined a soccer team and started having play dates with kids from the school. He stopped talking about needing to work or earn his keep. Jamie came over to our house more often now because Melanie and I talked regularly about countering Craig's messages to both boys. Jamie was starting to question some of the things his dad had told him about people being winners or workers. Things weren't perfect, and both boys still had bad days when Craig's old teachings crept back into their thinking. But they were beginning to understand that their worth wasn't something they had to prove or earn. I was still angry at Craig and probably always would be for what he did to Leo. But I focused my energy on making sure Leo knew the truth. He wasn't just regular, he was amazing exactly as he was, and he never had to earn his place in his own family ever again.